Hey guys, this is Dane with Garage Gunsmithing. Today I'm going to teach you how to install your rear pivot pin, your buffer retainer, and your buffer tube into your AR lower receiver. So the first thing you're going to want to take is your rear pivot pin. I've already oiled this a little bit. Line it up. Make sure that channel is lined up with this rear hole back there. Okay? Put your detent. Mine's a silver one. Some of you might have a gold one. It's the same thing. Put it back there in the hole and take your rear pivot pin spring, insert it in that same hole. Alright? Test it to make sure it's in the channel. It is. It catches. Next thing you're going to want to do, put a little bit of grease back here in these threads. Protect those threads. Protect that lower receiver. I'm going to do the same thing on the buffer tube, just a little bit. I'm using Aeroshell, the same thing you would use on a barrel nut. It's not necessary as it's aluminum to aluminum, not aluminum to steel, but it doesn't hurt, alright? Next thing, feed your castle nut onto your buffer tube like this. Feed it all the way back as far as you can, alright? You should have the larger openings towards the back, towards where the stock will go. That's what you're going to use to torque it down with your spanner wrench. Next thing, take your end plate. I'm using an aftermarket loop style, HK style end plate. And you're going to want to start feeding it into these threads right here as such. Make sure to keep that spring in mind right there though. Alright guys, I went ahead and changed angles. Make sure you're keeping that rear spring in mind. Make sure it's not falling out. Your end plate should be pretty close to it as of right now. But you want to make sure your buffer tube, as we thread it in, is not covering the buffer retainer hole yet. You're going to go ahead and drop your buffer retainer spring in there. And drop your buffer retainer. Alright? You're going to want to feed the buffer tube until the lips of the buffer tube cover that buffer retainer. And that's what's going to hold that retainer down. Alright guys, I went ahead and switched angles for a second. So you got the buffer tube holding that buffer retainer in place now on that lip. And you should have something that looks like this. Your spring of your rear pivot pin should be lined up with your end plate and your castle nut, but they're not yet tightened down. It's very important to make sure that that spring right there gets fed into the hole in the back of the receiver going straight. You don't want that bending. It's going to cause problems when you go to remove your pivot pin, alright? Start tightening down your castle nut, making sure that spring goes in perfectly straight. And then eventually you're going to want to push the end plate up against the receiver back. That way it's holding it tight, alright? Just like that. Function test the pivot pin. Make sure it's smooth. Make sure it's got good contact, alright? Alright, so once you've got that all done, after you function test, make sure this works correctly. Everything lines up perfect. The buffer retainer is held in place nice and strong. Not overly tight though. Everything works good. All the springs seem solid. What's up next is take your spanner wrench. I'm using a Tapco green wrench here on my workbench. The proper torque measurement for this per mil spec is 38 to 42 foot-pounds. I have plenty of barrel nut wrenches with torque wrench extensions on them, but I don't have a good castle nut wrench. It's not that important on the back of it. You can pretty much know when that's torqued down properly. If you watch like Windham Weaponry, they do the same thing. They just use their hand. Go ahead, get the wrench in those screws nice. Alright, so now you want to torque that thing down pretty tight. Get it nice and solid. I've done a few of these. I know where about 40 foot-pounds is. That's pretty dang good. Alright, you guys, the next part is very important. For some reason, some people don't do this and they use Loctite instead. You need to stake your castle nut per mil spec. That's going to keep it from backing out. So you have the larger cutouts in the back for your spanner wrench, and you have these small ones up front that line up with your end plate. What those are for is we're going to take a little bit of metal off the end plate and push it into one of those grooves with the use of a punch. Alright, I have a center punch here from Starrett. Some people use an automatic center punch. They're both going to work great. Just make sure you do this. There we go, guys. It's not beautiful, but it's a good stake. The point of it is to get a little bit of that steel from the end plate pushed into that divot. Make sure it's never going to back out on me, alright? Last step, you're going to want to take your spring and your buffer, put them together, slip it into the tube. Should push right into place just like that. You're just going to go up against that buffer retainer.